if your parents didn't create a safe container for you to process your feeling, you can grow up and feel traumatized.
Welcome back, everyone, to the Mind Valley podcast. Our guest today is Rhea Lalla, and she's been a regular on Mind Valley. Rhea is by far one of the wisest people I've ever interviewed when it comes to relating between human beings, particularly understanding yourself and understanding your kids. I interviewed her around 4 years back for an early interview on Mind Valley, back when we had a mentoring program. And the interview was really on parenting. And I can tell you that 45 minutes with Rhea changed aspects of how I parented my kids. Now, today's interview is broader than that. You don't have to be a parent to enjoy today's episode, but I want to stress how brilliant this lady's mind is. Today, we're going to be talking about how to diffuse triggers, traumas, and terror in yourself and in others. And what Rhea is going to share are 10 powerful practices. And so we're going to spend about 5 minutes per idea on how to diffuse the triggers and the trauma that actually you carry with you. So Rhea is a conscious parenting coach and a certified relationship coach for over 20 years. She works with adults and kids and has even created an emotional intelligence curriculum for parents and kids at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation schools. She has been with Mind Valley for many years, having led our children's education program at Mind Valley University and spoken on stage at Mind Valley on multiple occasions. Her articles, her live events, her books have been featured on radio and on Today's Parent, to name a few. And for those of you who want to check out Rhea's work in a greater way, her website is this. Feel free to take it down and dive into it anytime you want. It's buildgreatminds.com. That's super easy to remember, buildgreatminds.com. And that really is a theme for today's conversation, whether you're building a great mind in your child or you're building a great mind in yourself. So welcome to the Mind Valley podcast. Rhea, so good to see you again.
Great to see you, Vishen. It's been a while. So today we are talking about trauma, triggers, and terrors. So I'm gonna jump right into what trauma is. And trauma is the Greek word for wound. So when we were children, we had intense feelings and we never had the emotional resources to be able to handle what we experienced. So essentially we disassociated. So just to give you an example, imagine a child that's when you were a child, you're on a skateboard, maybe you're 4 and you fall and you cut your knee. And then all of a sudden your mom reacts and she goes, "Oh, look at all that blood." And she starts freaking out. And in that moment, you don't know what to do with all this energy and emotion and fear that's been cultivated. So you sort of disassociate from that moment. So as a result, when you grow up, you could have a fear of blood. You could have a fear of like moving things like bikes or skateboards. That's one way trauma can show up. But trauma is also anytime there was a fear or a hurt or a threat that occurred on a consistent basis when you were a child. And it fundamentally changes your brain architecture or your neural network. So for example, if when we were children, if we had controlling parents, if we didn't perceive we had enough power, if we were yelled at, put down, if your parents showed favoritism for one child or the other, they judged you, they criticized you, they ignored you, they abused you, those are all things that will fundamentally change your neural network in your mind. So that essentially is what trauma is. Now, trauma is also, people like to often think trauma might be, a parent beat you and locked you in a closet, right? That's trauma. But if we think of it as a wound, trauma is also what didn't happen to you. So let's suppose you were a child and you're thinking, I really want mom and dad to touch me, or I really want them to spend time connecting to me or knowing me. So any lack of attunement a parent had with a child, or if your parents didn't create a safe container for you to process your feeling, you can grow up and feel traumatized. And bearing in mind, when you're going through trauma, here's why your brain is changing. Because cortisol, which is the stress hormone, is being released. And that stress actually changes not just your neural networks, but it changes your higher executive functioning brain, which is your cortex. Yeah. So this can affect your learning and your memory. And one other thing that I think is really key to understand with trauma is it's not the event. People think that trauma has to do with the event. No, it's something happened and our autonomic nervous system started to release all these chemicals inside of us. And then those chemicals created basically a disassociation. So we went into a shutdown. This is why two people can experience a traumatic event, but one person codes it as something very different than the other.
By the way, that is a really, really powerful idea that you just said. Trauma is also what didn't happen to you.
Yes.
That was a mind flip. Thank you for saying that. Please go on.
Now, it's really important to remember, though, that a child coming into the world, all of us, when we came into the world, we never knew how to regulate our nervous system. No child does. That is learned always in the context of a parent. So a parent learns how to calm their own nervous system down and then helps the child understand the situation. So now you have all of us as children. We don't know how to regulate our own nervous system if our parents aren't helping us. We can't physically remove ourselves from the situation because we're in the house and we're kids and we can't go live somewhere else on our own. And we can't reduce the threat, especially if the threat is mom and dad, who aren't necessarily abusing us. They could just be ignoring us or criticizing us or comparing us to our sibling. So what happens is now as children, this is the interesting thing. We don't outgrow this experience of trauma or wounding. So it actually gets coded like a developer creating code. It actually gets coded in our body. So, if you have a child and they go and they touch a hot stove, they know, oh, that's dangerous. I'm not going to touch that hot stove again. This is not something that lessens with age or experience. This is trauma. The only way to be able to work through trauma is to actually, do a deep dive. So I'm just going to give you an example. I have a client who has a husband who is very argumentative and tends to be very disempowering. And she tends to get very numb and start to shut down. And so she says to me, why is it that I can't articulate anything in that moment, even though I know what he's saying is incorrect and I'm feeling abused by his words in this moment, but I literally go blank. Mm-hmm. And the reason why that's happening is this, through our coaching, we were able to see that this is something that happened in the context of her family and her caregivers. So as a result, she didn't feel that she had a voice. She didn't feel that she could express herself. And what happens is that she now separates and she can't remember because those cortisol has blocked her memory. So what really needs to happen in that moment is she needs somebody to help her complete the loop. All these chemicals went through and she disassociated from her feelings. She needs to go back and reintegrate that. So that she can feel the feeling through the completion. And remember, those feelings, they don't occur in your mind. You can't go for coffee with your friend and just try and think this out. It's something that happens somatically. Okay, so the leading experts in the world that talk about this, like Dr. Peter Levine or Dr. Gabor Mate, share that it's a somatic experience trauma. It happens in your body. And so, how is trauma showing up? So for all of you guys listening right now, trauma might be showing up in your life as an adult where you feel like you need to fix people. You feel like you need to people please. You find yourself in codependent relationships. You're looking for external validation all the time. Maybe you put up with abusive behaviors. You don't prioritize your needs. You don't have good boundaries. I mean, it's like the full gamut of things that you go, oh, what's wrong with me? Why am I doing this thing? Why do I keep hitting my head against the wall? The lack of confidence. These are all things that if you look back, you can find rooted in your childhood. But it was a survival mechanism in childhood that became a maladaptive behavior as an adult and trying to navigate.
A survival mechanism in childhood that becomes a maladaptive behavior. By the way, Rhea, the live audience is really loving you. Stephanie just wrote brilliant. Anna wrote, woohoo, you can't think through your trauma. And Megan said, Rhea is literally blowing my mind right now. It all makes so much sense.
Yeah. So, and what I mean by what was a survival mechanism in childhood, I like to use the example of moths to the light. Have I ever shared that with you, Vishen? Moths to the light? Yeah. Okay. So when you think about why do moths or any insect for that matter fly towards the light? The reason for that is long ago when there were no house lights or street lights, insects needed to survive, but the only source of light at nighttime was the moon. And the insect needed to preserve its life. So it didn't want to crash into a wall or crash into the ground. So the insect realized in its instinct, if I fly towards the light, I can fly up, but then there's a point where the air pressure changes and I know not to go any further. That keeps me from dying. That's genius. The problem is that all of a sudden we become an industrialized world, and then we have street lights and house lights and all sorts of lights. And the moth, which what was a very clever survival mechanism, a very adaptive behavior, has become maladaptive because now they're flying towards the house lights and the street lights and burning to a crisp. It's the same thing with us as adults. When we were children, maybe our parents were scolding us, and then we shut down because we felt that as they scold us, we don't have a voice, we can't express ourselves. But now it's not working for us as we grow up, because now with my wife, I'm not able to talk about things, right? Do you see that? Mm-hmm. So if your parents were scolding you you realize, okay, I have no voice, I have no say, and I'm just going to shut down. That doesn't work well. That's not adaptive. It's maladaptive now to shut down when you're trying to have a conversation with your wife. Maybe when you were young, it was adaptive to please other people, because I know if I please other people, mom's going to like me. Mom's going to think I'm a great person. However, and I'm going to get mom's love. However, it's not very good as an adult. It becomes maladaptive because I can't set and maintain healthy boundaries. So what worked well as a child, adaptive, people pleasing, is not working for me as an adult, and I feel unhappy with my life, right? So our relational somatic in your body trauma essentially is a lens that clouds the way you see the world. So unless you're willing to go back and revisit the trauma, then it's going to still be playing havoc in your life.
Is there a way, and I know you have 10 steps you're about to unveil to us, but questions that come to mind is, how do we identify the trauma we might be carrying and maybe not conscious of? And how do we fix it?
Okay, so that's a great question. There's a variety of different things that you can do for trauma specifically. And one of them is what Peter Levine calls somatic experiencing. So this is less of a cognitive experience. This is where you go into your body. And it helps if you have some sort of coach or therapist to help guide you through this, so that you can almost, so there's different things you can do for trauma. So somatic experiencing is where, instead of being in your head and talking and thinking about the problem, you start becoming viscerally aware of some of your tells. So for example, maybe with your spouse or your significant other or your children, you notice when something happens, I notice my throat gets tight. I notice there's pressure in my chest. I notice my hands get sweaty. There's a physiological signs that we can clue into. So that's just the beginning. If we start looking at those type of things, that can give us an insight that there's something else there. I'm going to get to triggers in a moment and how we work through triggers, because it sort of ties into things we can do with trauma as well. But the other piece is that now that we have the obvious signs, what are some of the more subtle signs? You see, a lot of time when I'm coaching and I ask people, how are they feeling? Or where do you feel that in your body? It could hit them as kind of woo-woo, or it could hit them as, what do you mean my body? Like they just want to stay up here in their mind. To go into their body can feel quite terrifying, because when you were a child and mom didn't do something or dad didn't do something, basically the two people that are supposed to love you the most in the world, yeah, you recognize, I have a need and I want you to do something for me and I don't know how to articulate. And then you realize, hey, the cavalry ain't coming. And for a child to sit with that nobody's coming, and these are the two people, and they didn't do it purposefully. They did based on their tools, but that didn't change the fact that we felt wounded at that and we created a worldview. I just want to mention a couple of things, like 5 things that help mitigate wounds and trauma. Okay. And that is something that we can look at now, whether or not we're doing this for ourselves now or for others, and also what happened when we were children. So really quickly, I call it the 5 A's. Okay. First A is attention. If you were a child and your parents didn't often, like more times than not always, pay mindful attention to you without judgment and attune to your feelings in a mirroring way and check in with you, if that was missing, there's a high likelihood that there's wounding that came from that. Okay, so if you didn't get the attention you wanted. The acceptance, if you didn't feel accepted for your feelings, your interests, your lifestyle, your choices, if they felt like your parents wanted to change you, they didn't accept you for who you were, then that can create trauma. If your parents didn't appreciate you, like if it was just your accomplishments, or maybe they played favorites, or they didn't acknowledge your gifts and do what they could to boost them, lack of appreciation will create wounding. Affection, fourth A, if you didn't get kissed and hugged and loved and shown attention in physical ways, and that attention wasn't welcomed by your parents, and you maybe you had some doubt about whether this caring would actually come to an end, that can create wounding. And then the last A is allowing. Did your parents try to know you? Did they try and understand your deepest needs and values and wishes? Did they say, no, be like me, unconsciously? Did they feel that you needed to caretake them and make sure they felt good? All of those things. Now, remember, no parent is going to score perfect marks on any of this. Okay, so this is not, everybody's got trauma and everybody's going to have triggers, which is what I'm going to get into next. And our parents weren't perfect in any of these, but those are the areas to look at if you're a parent, and also to just explore, did my parents give me these things? And if they didn't, then that's an opportunity to now start going into your body with usually the help of a coach or a therapist, and then be able to start feeling again. So you essentially here, this is what you're doing for trauma. Your body released all these chemicals, and your limbic system, like your amygdala, basically went into high alert. And it said, this feels too scary. I want to disassociate from this. When you go back and go into your body, what you're allowing yourself to do is complete that loop. Does that make sense? You're completing the loop. So that's what I'd recommend and there's a process that's involved. So I can talk more about that if you want to.
So let's just recap the 5 A's. Okay, so it's attention, acceptance, appreciation, affection, allowing.
Correct. Yes.
When I think back in my life, I've learned a lot about trauma from you, as well as from Shelley Lefko, who has been a brilliant guest on this podcast many times. Have you ever met Shelley?
I've never met her, but I followed her. Yes.
Yeah. So she and her late husband, Morty, created the Lefko method. And
yes.
they are dear friends. I remember a situation when I was maybe 7 years old, and I was crying because of a scary situation. And an older person in my family yelled at me for crying and told me that I was behaving like a baby. And for years, I saw crying as a weakness. And every time I cried, even if it was something worth crying for, like the death of a loved one,
yes.
As an adult male, I felt that I was not being a man. And so I suppressed my emotions for the longest time until recently, when I got rid of that. So it's really fascinating how this works.
How impactful something can just change and cloud. And how did you view other people crying or other men crying?
As a sign of weakness.
Yeah.
Literally. Yeah. And it's surprising. Like that is one thing that I think so many men get traumatized by, because strong fathers tell a little boy, hey, stop crying, be a man. Yes. Recently, for example, I heard about the news of Bob Proctor's death. Bob Proctor was a dear mentor of mine. He was one of the first Mind Valley authors.
I saw Bob Proctor live when I was 12 years old. My parents sent me, we were two young kids, Annie and I, in the front of that class. And I still love him to this day.
So Bob Proctor gave me many of my first big breaks. And when he died, I cried, and I got on a call with one of my ex-employees, Carl, who had worked with me on our projects with Bob. And both of us, grown adult men, cried with each other on the phone. It was actually a very beautiful bonding moment.
Beautiful.
And then I shared on Instagram, I cried today because my dear friend Bob Proctor passed away. And it was amazing the number of people who wrote to me and said, hey, Vishen, don't cry about it. Don't cry about it. And I wanted to reply to all of them and say, guys, I'm completely comfortable crying and admitting that I'm crying. I'm crying because he's a dear friend, and it's perfectly okay. But it's amazing. It took me a while to heal that, but I see that particular type of trauma with so many men of my age who are afraid to cry and so show their emotion.
Well, how many other people that didn't bother to write in that actually were liberated seeing you, Vishen, someone they admire and look up to, crying, which liberated them to maybe explore their own their own stories as to why they're not crying. So who knows what domino effect that had,
And
right?
that's why releasing trauma and also making sure that we don't pass it to the next generation is so important. I remember having a conversation with Shelley Lefko, and we were talking about parenting, and I was interviewing her, and I asked her, what is the most important thing for parents to do? And her response was really interesting. She said, the most important job of a parent, other than keeping your kids safe, is to simply ensure that you're not messing up their belief system, that you're only putting in them healthy and correct beliefs. Every single thing you do is creating a belief, and you got to make sure that you're not creating false beliefs. And that has been probably like one of the best parenting advices I've got. And you said the same thing in an interview we did 5 years ago.
Well, that story you shared about what a particularly impactful situation about the crying and how that played out in your life and with other people, and then having this moment to reflect and be inspired by others and recognize what was happening and start being able to be in touch with your tears. That's like a perfect movement into a trigger, because as you mentioned, well, when I asked the question, even when you saw other people crying, it triggered you, right?
Yeah.
Because you saw it as weakness. So what is a trigger now? A trigger is an archaic, it's basically a throwback to an archaic trauma that feels like it's happening in the present. So anytime we withdraw, we feel hurt, we feel angry, we feel unsafe or insecure, it tells us that we have a wound that needs to be healed. Okay, so this is like a little tip to have in your pocket. If you're feeling withdrawn, hurt, angry, unsafe, insecure, that is your indicator that there's a wound that needs to be healed. Okay, so how do we begin to understand our triggers? Something to recognize about triggers is, again, triggers occur in the body. There are certain things that can exacerbate a trigger. For example, songs, movies, smells. I don't know if any of those things, witnessing something in someone else, someone's behavior, their tone. If you're tired, a trigger can go up. But when you're triggered by something, this is the opportunity that you get to now begin to do a deep dive into where did this begin. So now I want to share with you some things to some specific tools that you can use to start understanding your triggers. Because remember, the trauma happened, and now you grow up and you're trying to interact with your neighbor and your spouse and your children, and you're getting triggered because you're feeling hurt all the time, or you're feeling misunderstood all the time, or you're feeling angry, or you're feeling insecure. Okay. So the first step would be to do something very proactive. Okay. For everyone that's listening today, get out a pen, not now necessarily, but later. You can make a note and write down what your top 3 emotional triggers are. What are the things that cause you to feel the most upset and the most thrown off balance? Does that make sense? Okay. Mm-hmm. So, for example, maybe someone's criticizing you. Maybe there's a moment where you feel unlovable and you feel angry. You don't feel seen. I want you to start approaching those situations, whatever you wrote down, with curiosity, and try and start with the trigger that has the least emotional charge. Okay. So we don't want to avoid this. We want to just start noticing out of what we've noticed as our top 3. Is there any patterns? Am I getting a chance to go into my shadow or my unconscious? Do I do like this thing that's triggering me? When this person does this, they come at me and they have an angry face. Do I do the same thing that they're doing? Or maybe see what generally happens is we get triggered by somebody or something and we go, I wouldn't do that. I don't like that. Why did they say and do that? I would never do that. That's the trigger. We have this as we're different and this other person is doing something to us. In this step, what we want to do is start to look at, am I in places that I haven't tuned into doing the exact same thing? Is this maybe a mirror that's showing myself? Are they revealing something unacknowledged in myself? Okay, so this is your first step, because then you can get a very good insight into what are the things that piss you off and drive you crazy, and use that as a springboard to try and understand yourself. Maybe it's part of your ego. Maybe you're thinking, this person doesn't see my brilliance or my greatness. They don't see that I'm entitled to some sort of special treatment. Maybe this person reminds me of an earlier life experience. Like, when I see this, is this my mom or my dad that I'm seeing? Do I put their face on this bystander, on my back somehow in my childhood home. These are things that will give you an insight. Why do we want to do this? We want to do this because we don't want those adaptive behaviors from our childhood playing havoc in our current relationships and our feelings of calm and joy. So this is generally what's happening. And guess who's going to trigger you the most out of everybody? The people closest to you. It's not going to be, how much power someone has in your life will be a function of how triggered you get by them. That's why your neighbor could say something and you go, oh, who cares? But your spouse says it and you're angry, right? So how much power you give to someone is going to affect that. Okay, so that's the first thing. The next thing you want to do, number 2, is you want to notice any hyperarousal in your body. Remember I said that trauma and triggers, trauma is stored in the body. You want to look for, am I speaking really loudly? Am I sweaty? Is my body, do I feel tension in my chest, tightness in my throat? And the reason why you want to do that is because your body is going to give you an indicator that I'm feeling triggered right now. And you want to be able to catch it before you say a whole bunch of things that create a whole bunch of mess that you have to clean up. You're trying to create the least amount of disaster and mess, right? So you want to start noticing what's happening inside of your body. For me, I'm at a place in my life, not always, but more times than not, where I go, oh, wait a second. It feels like something's stepping on my chest. Something must be worrying me or something must be angering me. Okay. The next thing you want to do, number 3, is name the trigger. So I might say something like as simple as, I'm feeling really triggered right now, or I'm feeling really angry right now, or I'm feeling misunderstood right now. The mere fact of naming it takes you out of your amygdala hijack, reptile brain, and into the current here and now. So you're literally going from your earliest brain to your higher thinking brain simply by naming it. So I've often held on to my husband's hand, and not that often, but often enough where I'm upset about something. And as I'm squeezing his hand, I go, I'm really angry at you, but I'm not pulling the love away, but I'm still stating so that I can get out of that fight or flight. Okay, so number 4 is you want to own the feeling that you feel. Meaning, if I'm feeling angry or I'm feeling jealous or I'm feeling insecure, any amount that you don't give it a dignity and an intelligence and you try and sweep it under the rug because you don't feel that lofty people have these types of feelings, then the feeling's going to stay. It literally just crosses its arms and says, I ain't going anywhere until you pay some attention to me. So you want to make sure that you're not doing any shame, blame, or make wrong for whatever feeling you're feeling. Okay. Also, you want to give yourself a little bit of space. There's something very beautiful about the idea of 6 seconds. So 6 seconds is the time it takes for an emotion. So basically emotion is where all these chemicals are being released in your body. So you have something that's coming at you that has a charge or upsets you. And then all of a sudden, within 6 seconds, your hypothalamus releases chemicals. It gets broken down in your body, and then it gets absorbed by your body. 6 seconds. That means that anything past 6 seconds, you are choosing to refuel or generate the feeling again through your mind looping. Does that make sense?
Wow. Okay. So that's really interesting. Can you go deeper on that one? 6 seconds?
Mm-hmm. Okay. So basically, when your hypothalamus releases hormones, mm-hmm. it's broken down and absorbed in the body within 6 seconds. So if we feel something longer than 6 seconds, we are at some level choosing to recreate and refuel those feelings. Meaning what we're in is a cognitive loop. Why did they say that? I wouldn't say that. That's not very nice. That's actually making me feel defensive. They're being a mean person. That's a loop that we're doing. But the actual chemicals that created the emotion only last 6 seconds. So why is that empowering to me? It's empowering to me because I like having choice. I like feeling like I'm in control of my feelings and my feelings don't have me. So if I know, now that thought alone doesn't mean you're all of a sudden going to be 6 seconds and I'm done. For me, it helps me recognize that 6 seconds, my whole body has been flooded by the big sine wave as I'm going up the emotion. And now I'm peaking at the top of the sine wave. And now at this point, I can do something that can get me out of this loop that I'm going to be in, where I'm thinking about it, I'm obsessing about it, I'm still upset about it. That puts me back in the driver's seat. So I like feeling that I have the ability to do something. And that 6 seconds is the amount of time that scientists figured out.
That's a really, really, really useful insight.
So 6 seconds. And bearing in mind, when we get upset, we lose objectivity, right? We become in fight or flight. So we want to go to number 6, which is where we regulate our nervous system. Regulating your nervous system, as I mentioned, nobody is born knowing how to do this. This is done in the context of a parent or caregiver that taught us how to co-regulated with us, meaning they calmed their nervous system. They helped us make sense of this confusing, baffling experience. And then we came to now understand it, and we learned how to calm down. So if we didn't have parents that were able to do that for us, we tend to maybe feel very anxious as an adult. So what we want to do is we want to learn how to do this ourselves. So self-regulation is really about going back to the present moment. What's the opposite of trigger? It's the ability to witness. Just witness, like a cloud is floating by. You're witnessing that I'm having a feeling. So you want to start focusing on where in your body is the stress stored. Is it in my chest? Is it in my throat? Is it in my shoulders? And you want to stay with those sensations as long as possible until it begins to subside. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Now, for some people out there that might be going, when I think back to my past, I can't even remember it. And I can't really get into my body. Usually because they become very disassociated from their body. So one of the things that I would do as a coach is just start remembering that you have a body. So just feel your fingertips, just feel your toes, feel the pang of hunger, feel what it feels like when you need to go to the washroom and pee. That just gets them re-embodied that I have a body. And then you can keep working down the path to start getting into some of the traumas and where that's stored. Just quickly, because I know we want to get to some questions and stuff like that, but number 7 is to make sure that you have a very supportive inner voice that advocates for us. So, it can feel quite terrifying when we don't handle a situation well and we feel that we got upset and we said things. We want to be able to ensure that our voice is nourishing and nurturing to us in a way that maybe our parents didn't do, but we're going to do it right now for ourselves. We're going to advocate. You know what? It's okay that you said that. It's okay that you did that. You're still a lovable person. You want to maybe use reframing techniques like NLP, do affirmations, something that allows you to not feel that you suck. Okay. And that's really important. 8, perspective taking. This is huge. Sometimes when my husband trips me up and triggers me, I can think because he becomes my attachment figure. And I've now been all of a sudden pushed back to this moment in my own childhood because he does something. And I don't realize that I'm speaking from a childhood wound. And in that moment, I think, you're complaining about something and I don't even understand why you're complaining. And I'm feeling attacked in that moment, right? Perspective taking allows me to look and step outside myself, climb into his mind and go, is he trying to attack me and destroy me and like the mother of his kids and the person that he loves? Or is his intention something that I've misconstrued, right? So perspective taking can allow me to look at what this person's intentions are and then now recognize, okay, I got triggered by what they said, but I'm bringing something to this story. I'm creating a story here. And so sometimes perspective taking can often help you see the wood from the trees. So that's 8. 9 would be to seek the source, like track the trigger's origin. For me, my advice to everybody, if Shirley Lefko gave you one, would be to know yourself. If a parent spends time trying to understand the whys, what they do and why they do it, then you get a chance to understand when my child does this, why is it when my child doesn't listen to me or doesn't wear the clothes that I bought for them or defies me in this moment? Why am I so triggered? So taking the time to understand why this trigger is there and seeking the source is very important. And lastly, when you have trauma that shows up in your triggers as you interact with the world, it's helpful to look and see if you can get some sort of coaching. Again, for trauma, it's very difficult to go out with your girlfriend and talk about the problem and get through your trauma. it's generally something that helps to be in a very safe container to have somebody support you, whoever that is.
Thank you, Rhea. Would you mind repeating those 10 steps again? And I know this was super fast, but if you could just re-articulate them. And if anyone is taking notes on Mindvalley Insights, you will be able to see those notes under insights.mindvalley.com. It's an open collaborative note-taking utility that Mindvalley runs. So type in Rhea and you will likely find notes on this call. Rhea, please go ahead.
So the first one is, I recommend for everybody to identify your top 3 emotional triggers, just so you can do a deep dive to begin to explore them. Okay. And look for patterns. Number 2, you want to be able to notice any signs of hyperarousal in your body. So what are, dizziness, sweaty palms, pain in your chest, just so you can notice what is the somatic tells of your trauma or your triggers. Number 3, you want to be able to name the trigger. It's like name it to tame it. So you can say, I'm feeling triggered right now, or I'm feeling angry right now, or I'm feeling sad right now. Number 4, you want to own your feelings. Don't marginalize your feelings. So own your feelings without shame, blame, or make wrong, whatever feeling you happen to feel. Number 6, you want to give yourself some space. We talked about the 6 seconds, but sometimes you might want to take a little time out for yourself so that you can be able to regroup and go through the completion of that sine wave of the feeling. Number 6, you want to be able to regulate your nervous system. So this is where you're using all the tools that you've amassed. And if you don't feel you have good tools, then now's the time to start building them on how do you calm your nervous system down. I recommend doing something that involves somatic exercises where you go into your body and you start feeling your feelings and how they're morphing and changing within your body. So usually at the end of that, you can get to epiphanies. Number 7, make sure you have a very supportive inner voice that is advocating for you, that is reminding you of your magnificence, that is reaffirming to you using reframing techniques. Number 8, use perspective taking. Try and see the wood from the trees to see, is this person really trying to attack me, or could I be bringing something to the conversation that doesn't need to be there? Number 9, you want to seek the source of the trigger. So this is where you're, again, doing the deep dive right now as you just experienced this trigger for where did this come from? What story am I telling myself? What belief am I holding on to? And lastly, if there's some particular trauma that you want to work through, which to me is probably an incredible gift you give to your family, your loved one, your kids, is seek some coaching with a therapist or a coach so that you can work through these feelings.
Amazing. So for all of you who are listening, if you want to get that list, go to insights.mindvalley.com and search for triggers, and you will find a note attached to this call. Insights is simply a collaborative note-taking tool that our members use to share notes and ideas with each other.
And I'm just taking a quick look at the comments, and I see that some people have found tapping. CBT can be quite incredible. TBT for trauma, where you titrate how much exposure you have to something to help you through trauma. Again, there's EFT tapping. Yep. Great.
Fantastic. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all.